London, April 1813. The ballroom of Ashford House blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, their flames reflected in mirrors that lined the silk-panelled walls, creating an illusion of endless golden brilliance that dazzled the eye and intoxicated the senses. Isabella Ashworth paused at the entrance to the grand assembly, her gloved hand resting lightly on the marble balustrade as she surveyed the glittering scene below. The air shimmered with heat and perfume, an intoxicating blend of rose water and expensive French scents that the ladies wore despite the war, mingling with the sharp scent of beeswax and the faint musk of so many bodies pressed together in fashionable proximity. The orchestra played a waltz, the scandalous dance now permitted in the finest houses, and couples swirled across the polished floor in a kaleidoscope of jewel-toned silks and stark black evening dress. Isabella descended the stairs with practiced grace, aware of the eyes that turned toward her, the whispers that followed in her wake like a familiar shadow. Mrs. Ashworth, the charming widow. Mrs. Ashworth with her modest fortune and her even more modest past, yet somehow she had secured invitations to the most exclusive events of the season. She wore a gown of deep sapphire silk that brought out the unusual violet undertones in her blue eyes, cut fashionably but not daringly, expensive but not extravagant, the perfect costume for a woman who must be noticed but not too closely examined. Her dark hair was dressed simply, with a single strand of pearls, the only jewelry she owned that was genuinely her own, inherited from a grandmother she had loved in a life that felt impossibly distant now. She moved through the crowd with the ease of long practice, her smile warm but not intimate, her manner engaging but never forward, the perfect balance that had taken her 3 years to perfect. Tonight her target was Lord Hartley, a pompous man of 50 with a weakness for attractive women and an unfortunate tendency toward indiscretion after his 3rd glass of champagne. He possessed information about certain members of Parliament who had expressed sympathy for French interests, details that Lord Carstairs had tasked her with obtaining before the week was out. She spotted Hartley near the refreshment table, already flushed with wine and self-importance, holding court among a small group of gentlemen. Isabella was calculating her approach, preparing the right combination of flattery and apparent fascination that would separate him from his companions, when she felt it. A gaze, heavy and assessing, pressed against her consciousness like a physical touch. She turned, her trained instincts searching for the source, and found herself staring across the crowded ballroom directly into the eyes of Alexander Pembroke, the Duke of Thornfield. He stood at the far side of the room, a tall figure in impeccable evening dress, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples, his bearing that of a man, utterly secure in his position and power. But it was his eyes that arrested her, dark and penetrating and far too knowing, watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken with something that felt dangerously like fear. Isabella forced her attention away from the Duke and back to her target, her heart still beating irregularly from the weight of that penetrating gaze. But years of training steadied her hands and smoothed her expression into pleasant neutrality. She had learned long ago to compartmentalize fear, to lock it away in some deep recess of herself where it could not interfere with the work that kept her alive and fed and housed in precarious security. It had been 3 years since the afternoon when Lord Edmund Carstairs had appeared at her shabby lodgings in Cheapside, a week after her husband Thomas had been buried in an unmarked grave, his gambling debts having consumed even the money for a proper headstone. She had been 25 years old, a widow with no family, no fortune, and no prospects beyond seeking employment as a governess or companion if any respectable family would overlook the circumstances of her husband's death. Carstairs had been impeccably dressed and unnervingly well-informed, knowing details about Thomas's debts and the men to whom he had owed money. dangerous men who might consider a young widow fair payment for outstanding accounts. He had offered her a choice that was not really a choice at all. Work for him, using the very attributes that made her vulnerable as a woman to gather information from men who would never suspect her or be left to the mercy of her late husband's creditors. She had accepted with the hollow resignation of someone who had already lost everything that mattered, and found that survival itself could become a purpose when nothing else remained. Carstairs had trained her carefully, teaching her how to listen more than speak, how to ask questions that seemed like admiration, how to create a persona that was appealing but not scandalous, charming but not threatening. The kind of woman powerful men enjoyed talking to because she made them feel clever and important without demanding anything inconvenient in return. He had provided her with a modest income, a small house, a fabricated history as the respectable widow of a minor gentleman, and a steady stream of targets from whom she was to extract secrets. She had told herself she was serving England, protecting her country from French threats and domestic traitors, and perhaps in the beginning that had even been true. Now she moved through Lord Hartley's defences with practised ease, joining the group of gentlemen with a self-deprecating comment about the crush of the ballroom that made them laugh and expand their circle to include her. Within 10 minutes she had manoeuvred Hartley away from his companions with the suggestion that she required refreshment, and perhaps he might assist her in navigating to the terrace where the air was less stifling. He complied with transparent eagerness, and as they stood in the relative quiet of the torch-lit terrace overlooking the gardens, she deployed her full arsenal of charm and carefully calibrated interest, drawing him out about his recent committee work, laughing at his pompous observations, and extracting every detail she needed about the parliamentary members who had been corresponding with known French sympathizers. All the while she remained aware of the Duke of Thornfield, somewhere in the ballroom behind her, those dark, knowing eyes perhaps still watching, seeing through her performance to the calculating operative beneath the silk and pearls and false smiles. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Isabella had secured the information she needed within 40 minutes of engaging Lord Hartley, committing his indiscreet revelations to memory with the precision born of long practice. And now she wanted nothing more than to escape the suffocating heat of the ballroom and retreat to the safety of her small townhouse, where she could shed the persona of the charming widow like an ill-fitting gown, and simply breathe without calculation. She made her excuses to Hartley with exactly the right blend of regret and propriety, suggesting fatigue from the late hour, and slipped away from the terrace through the far door that led into the less populated corridors of Ashford House, moving quickly toward the entrance hall, where her cloak would be waiting. But as she turned the corner into a portrait-lined corridor, illuminated only by widely spaced wall sconces that created pools of amber light separated by deep shadow, a tall figure detached itself from the darkness near a towering arrangement of hothouse flowers and stepped directly into her path. The Duke of Thornfield stood before her, blocking the narrow passage between marble pedestals that held classical busts, his expression unreadable in the uncertain light, but his posture relaxed, as though he had been waiting specifically for her and had all the time in the world. Isabella's pulse accelerated with a warning that years of training had honed into an almost preternatural awareness of danger, but she smoothed her features into pleasant surprise and offered him a polite smile. "Your Grace?" she said, her voice carrying just the right note of flattered confusion. "I did not expect to encounter anyone in this quiet corner." He inclined his head with perfect courtesy, but his dark eyes remained fixed on her face with that same unsettling intensity she had felt across the crowded ballroom. "Mrs. Ashworth," he replied, his voice a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate in the confined space between them. "I confess I hoped for an opportunity to speak with you away from the crush. You left the ballroom so precipitously that I thought perhaps the evening had not agreed with you." Isabella deployed her practiced charm, allowing a self-deprecating laugh to colour her words. "Only the heat, Your Grace, and perhaps too much champagne and too little supper. I fear I am not as robust as I should be for these grand occasions." He studied her for a long moment, and she had the unsettling sensation that he was cataloguing every detail of her appearance, from the careful arrangement of her hair to the modest cut of her gown, weighing and measuring, and finding something that did not quite align with the picture she presented. "You seem remarkably robust to me, Mrs. Ashworth," he said quietly, and she could not determine if the comment was compliment or challenge. "Tell me, how long have you been widowed?" The question was innocuous enough, the sort of polite inquiry anyone might make, but something in his tone suggested it was anything but casual. 3 years, she replied, maintaining her composure, though her mind raced to calculate what he might know or suspect. "My husband died rather suddenly, and I have been in mourning and then adjusting to my changed circumstances ever since. And your late husband, he was in trade, I believe?" She had prepared answers to these questions years ago, a carefully constructed history that would satisfy curiosity without inviting too much scrutiny. "He was a gentleman of modest means with interests in shipping, Your Grace. We were not wealthy, but comfortable until his death revealed certain debts I had not known existed." The Duke nodded slowly, as though considering this information against some internal standard of truth. "Yet you have managed to establish yourself quite firmly in society despite these difficulties. You have friends among some very influential men." The way he emphasized the word friends sent ice down her spine despite the warm air of the corridor. She was no longer certain whether this was ordinary conversation or interrogation, whether he was making polite talk or circling toward some accusation she could not yet perceive. "I have been fortunate in the kindness of those who knew my family," she said carefully, "and society values pleasant company at their entertainments. I try to be agreeable." "You succeed admirably," he said, and again that double edge lurked beneath the courtesy. "In fact, I would very much enjoy the pleasure of a dance with you at Lady Pemberton's ball next week. It is not a request I make lightly, Mrs. Ashworth. I find you remarkably interesting." Before she could formulate a response that would neither accept nor refuse too directly. He had bowed and stepped past her, his shoulder nearly brushing hers in the narrow space, and continued down the corridor toward the ballroom, leaving her standing alone in the flickering shadows with her heart pounding in the certain knowledge that her carefully constructed world had just shifted on its foundations in ways she could not yet comprehend, but definitely feared. Isabella waited until the following afternoon to meet Lord Carstairs at their usual location, a nondescript coffee-house in a less fashionable quarter of the city where the clientele minded their own business and the proprietor had been well paid to ensure discretion, and she arrived precisely at 3 o'clock as instructed, finding him already seated in the corner booth he favoured, his angular face impassive as he watched her approach through the haze of pipe smoke that hung in the low-ceilinged room. She slid into the seat across from him and recited the information she had gathered from Lord Hartley in a low, steady voice, omitting nothing of substance, but keeping her tone clinical and detached, as she had learned to do, transforming human vulnerability into strategic intelligence as though she were reporting on the weather rather than exploiting the loose tongue of a pompous man who had thought himself charming a pretty widow. Carstairs listened without interruption, his pale eyes fixed on her face with the cold assessment of a man who valued results above all other considerations. And when she finished, he nodded once in satisfaction before making notes in the small leather journal he always carried. "You have done well," he said, and there was no warmth in the compliment, only acknowledgement of a task completed to standard. But then Isabella made the mistake of mentioning the Duke of Thornfield, keeping her voice carefully neutral as she explained his unexpected attention and the pointed nature of his questions, thinking Carstairs should know that someone of such prominence had taken an interest in her activities. The change in Carstairs was immediate and alarming, his expression hardening into something that made her stomach clench with instinctive fear as he leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The Duke of Thornfield is not a man to be trifled with, Mrs. Ashworth," he said, and she heard the warning beneath the words, the implicit threat that her usefulness depended on her ability to avoid exactly this sort of complication. "Thornfield is known for his integrity and his insufferable sense of duty, and more relevantly, he has been advising the Crown on matters of internal security for the past 2 years, investigating foreign intelligence operations and rooting out threats to the realm with the thoroughness of a man who believes absolutely in right and wrong. If he has noticed you, if he suspects anything at all about your activities, you are compromised and possibly dangerous to the entire network." Isabella felt ice forming in her chest as the implications became clear, understanding that to Carstairs she was merely a tool that could be discarded if it became a liability, that whatever protection he had offered her 3 years ago would evaporate instantly if he deemed her a risk. She assured him that the Duke seemed merely socially interested, nothing more, deploying the skills of deception that had kept her alive to convince her handler that the situation was manageable, but she could see the calculation in his eyes as he weighed her words against his own assessment of danger. "Stay away from Thornfield," Carstairs ordered flatly, refusing his invitations and avoiding situations where you might encounter him, because I cannot have one of my most productive operatives drawing the attention of a man who has the ear of the Prime Minister and the resources to investigate anyone he chooses. Then, as though the matter of the Duke was already settled and forgotten, Carstairs shifted to her next assignment, with the smooth efficiency of a man who wasted no time on unnecessary sentiment, explaining that she would be attending a house party at Westbrook Manor in 10 days' time, where Lord Westbrook kept correspondence in his private study that contained information about supply routes and military contractors that certain interested parties would pay handsomely to obtain. Isabella listened with the sick resignation of someone trapped in a machine that would not stop, committing the details to memory even as her mind remained fixed on the Duke of Thornfield and the growing certainty that her carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble in ways she could neither prevent nor fully understand. Isabella had been dreading Lady Pemberton's musical 3 days since her meeting with Carstairs, hoping she might fabricate an excuse to avoid the intimate evening gathering where guests would be seated in close proximity with little opportunity to maneuver or escape unwanted conversation, but she had received no further assignments that might justify her absence, and to withdraw suddenly from social engagements would itself raise questions she could not afford. So she arrived at the Pemberton townhouse at the appointed hour, dressed in a gown of pale blue silk that she had worn twice before, because her limited wardrobe did not allow for constant novelty, steeling herself for an evening of careful navigation through the assembled company. The music room had been arranged with chairs in semicircular rows facing the pianoforte, where Miss Pemberton would perform, along with 2 other accomplished young ladies, and Isabella took a seat near the side where she might observe without being too conspicuous, exchanging pleasantries with Mrs. Henderson and Lady Cartwright, who occupied the chairs beside her. But she had been seated for less than 5 minutes when she felt that now familiar sensation of being watched and looked up to find the Duke of Thornfield standing in the doorway, scanning the room until his eyes found hers and held them with an expression that conveyed both determination and something that might have been warmth. He crossed the room directly to her position, despite the availability of seats in less crowded areas, and with effortless authority that came from a lifetime of privilege, he convinced the gentleman seated directly behind Isabella to exchange places with him, settling into the chair so close that she could feel the heat radiating from his body and smell the faint scent of sandalwood that clung to his coat. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said quietly as the room settled and prepared for the performance to begin, "I am pleased to find you here this evening. I had hoped for another opportunity to continue our conversation from Ashford House." Isabella kept her voice low and her expression pleasantly neutral despite the rapid acceleration of her pulse. "Your Grace, I did not expect to see you at a musical. I understood you had little patience for such entertainments." He leaned slightly closer, ostensibly to keep their conversation from disturbing others, but creating an intimacy that made her acutely aware of every inch of space between them. "I confess I do not usually attend these affairs, but I have recently discovered that the company can make even the most tedious evening worthwhile. And besides, I find myself increasingly interested in the masks people wear in society, the performances we all give to maintain our places in this elaborate dance of reputation and appearance." The way he emphasized the words masks and performances sent a chill of warning through Isabella's chest. But before she could respond, Miss Pemberton began to play, and conversation became impossible, leaving Isabella to sit rigidly in her chair, with the Duke's words echoing in her mind and his presence beside her, making it nearly impossible to focus on the music. When the first piece concluded and polite applause filled the room, Alexander spoke again with that same conversational tone that somehow carried deeper meaning. "Tell me, Mrs. Ashworth, do you ever tire of the performance, of maintaining the character you have created for society's consumption? Or have you worn the mask so long it has become your true face?" She turned to look at him directly, searching his expression for clarity about whether he was speaking in metaphor or making a specific accusation, and found his dark eyes studying her with an intensity that suggested he saw far more than she wanted anyone to see. "I think we all wear masks to some degree, Your Grace," she replied carefully, presenting to the world what it expects rather than what we truly are. Surely even a duke must sometimes play a role required by his position. He nodded slowly, as though considering her words, but then said something that made her breath catch in her throat. "Indeed, but I wonder if you chose your role, or if it was forced upon you by circumstances beyond your control. I wonder if you remember who you were before you became who you pretend to be." Before Isabella could formulate any response that would not reveal too much, Alexander shifted topics with the smooth grace of a skilled conversationalist. "I understand you will be attending the house party at Westbrook Manor. Next week, my cousin mentioned you had accepted Lady Westbrook's invitation. What a fortunate coincidence that I too will be in attendance." It was not a coincidence, and they both knew it. His casual mention of her travel plans revealing knowledge that should not be easily available to him, and when she asked permission to call on her later that week, he phrased it with such certainty that refusal seemed impossible without creating exactly the sort of scene that would draw unwanted attention. So Isabella heard herself agreeing, even as every instinct screamed that this man represented a danger she could neither predict nor control, and that her carefully constructed world was becoming more fragile with every conversation they shared. Alexander Pembroke arrived at Isabella's townhouse on Thursday afternoon precisely at 3 o'clock as propriety dictated, his carriage bearing the Thornfield crest drawing curious glances from neighbours, who likely wondered what business a duke could have with the modest widow who occupied the narrow residence on the unfashionable end of Grosvenor Street, and Isabella watched his approach from her drawing-room window with a mixture of dread and something she refused to examine too closely, aware that allowing him into her private space represented a vulnerability she had carefully avoided for 3 years. She had prepared the rooms as well as her limited resources allowed, instructing her single maid to ensure everything appeared respectable, if unremarkable. But as she admitted Alexander into the small entrance hall and led him to the drawing room, she saw her surroundings through his eyes and understood how much they revealed about the fiction she had constructed. The furniture was adequate but impersonal, the sort of pieces that came with a leased property, and the few decorative items scattered about possessed no history or sentiment, merely objects purchased to create the impression of a life rather than evidence of an actual one lived. Alexander accepted her offer of tea with courteous thanks and settled into the chair opposite hers with the easy grace of a man comfortable in any setting. But she noticed how his gaze traveled around the room with quiet attention, pausing on the single portrait above the mantel that purported to be her late husband, but was in fact a painting she had purchased from a street vendor for £2, noting the bookshelf that held volumes too pristine to have been read with any frequency, observing the complete absence of the small personal treasures that accumulated in homes where people actually lived rather than merely resided. "Your home is very neat, Mrs. Ashworth," he remarked after Mrs. Davies had delivered the tea and withdrawn, almost unnaturally so, as though you have just moved in or are preparing to move away at a moment's notice. Isabella kept her hand steady as she poured, refusing to let him see how deeply his observation had penetrated. "I have simple tastes, Your Grace, and prefer not to clutter my surroundings with unnecessary sentiment." He accepted the cup she offered, but did not drink, instead continuing his unsettling examination of her space and, by extension, herself. "I find that people's homes tell stories about them. The objects they choose to keep and display reveal what they value and where they have been. But your home tells no story at all, which is itself rather revealing." She deflected with the skills she had honed through countless dangerous conversations, steering the discussion toward neutral topics of weather and current events. But Alexander refused to remain in shallow waters, and within minutes had guided their exchange into deeper territory, speaking of loyalty and patriotism in ways that seemed to invite her perspective. "Tell me, Mrs. Ashworth, what do you believe we owe our country in times of war? Are there actions that become acceptable in service to a greater cause that would be unconscionable in ordinary circumstances?" Isabella felt the trap in the question, but found herself genuinely engaged despite her caution, her true self responding before her careful mask could prevent it. "I believe that war demands sacrifices," she said slowly, "that some people give their lives on battlefields while others surrender different things in service to the same cause. But I wonder sometimes if the moral complexities are ever truly considered, or if we simply justify what we must do by claiming noble purpose." Alexander leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "And what have you sacrificed, Isabella? What has this war cost you that others do not see?" The use of her Christian name without permission should have offended her, but instead felt like an intimacy she had not realized she craved. And for a dangerous moment she wanted to tell him everything, to unburden herself of the weight she had carried alone for so long. But survival instinct prevailed, and she retreated behind her carefully constructed walls. "I have sacrificed no more than any other widow, Your Grace, merely learning to navigate a world that has little place for women without protection or resources." He studied her for a long moment before setting down his untouched tea and rising to take his leave. But at the door he paused and spoke words that seemed both warning and invitation. "Isabella, I would ask you to reconsider your plans to attend the house party at Westbrook Manor. I have reason to believe it would be wiser for you to remain in London, and though I cannot explain my concerns, I hope you will trust that I speak from knowledge of dangers you may not fully appreciate." Isabella did not sleep that night after the Duke departed her townhouse with his unsettling warning still echoing in her mind, instead lying in the darkness of her bedchamber, watching shadows move across the ceiling as her thoughts circled endlessly through the impossible maze that had become her life, trying to make sense of Alexander Pembroke's behavior and intentions while wrestling with the growing realization that she was in far deeper danger than she had ever allowed herself to acknowledge in the 3 years since Carstairs had recruited her into this shadowed world of secrets and lies. His warning about Westbrook Manor could only mean one thing, that he knew the true purpose of her attendance at the house party, which meant he had been watching her activities with far more attention than she had realized, tracking her movements and connections with the keen intelligence she had witnessed in their conversations. And if he knew about her mission, then he must know about Carstairs and the entire network of informants and operatives that gathered intelligence under the guise of social connection and romantic intrigue. The rational course would be to flee London immediately, to disappear into the countryside, or perhaps take ship to the continent where she might rebuild some semblance of a life beyond the reach of both Carstairs and whoever else might come looking for a spy whose cover had been compromised. But Isabella had learned in her years of desperation that survival required resources, and she possessed nothing beyond what Carstairs provided. No independent means or family connections that might shelter her, no husband or protector to shield her from the consequences of abandoned duty. If she fled, Carstairs would wash his hands of her, and she would be left with nothing, worse than nothing, because she would carry the stain of suspicion that could follow her anywhere she tried to hide. But if she stayed and continued with the mission as planned, she walked knowingly into a situation where the Duke of Thornfield would be watching her every move, with eyes that seemed to see through every mask she had learned to wear. What disturbed her even more than the professional danger was the personal confusion that had taken root in her chest like a vine growing through cracks in stone, the way her pulse had quickened when Alexander leaned close at the musicale, the unexpected pleasure she had felt in their philosophical conversation about duty and sacrifice, the dangerous moment in her drawing room when she had wanted to tell him everything and unburden herself of secrets that had grown heavier with each month of carrying them alone. She recognized these feelings as weakness, as the kind of emotional vulnerability that could destroy an operative whose survival depended on maintaining absolute control over every interaction and never allowing genuine connection to compromise careful calculation. Yet she could not seem to stop herself from replaying their conversations in her mind and wondering what it might be like to be truly seen by someone like Alexander Pembroke, to be known completely and accepted rather than deceived and used. As grey dawn light began to filter through her curtains, Isabella made her decision with the weary resignation of someone who had long ago run out. Of good choices, she would proceed to Westbrook Manor as Carstairs had ordered because she had no viable alternative, but she would exercise far greater caution than usual and watch the Duke as carefully as he watched her, trying to discern his true intentions and whether he represented a threat to be evaded, or perhaps, in some scenario she barely dared imagine, an unexpected ally who might understand the impossible position in which circumstances had trapped her. Westbrook Manor rose from the Hampshire countryside like something from a painted landscape, its golden stone glowing warm in the late afternoon sun as Isabella's carriage rolled up the long gravel drive on the 14th of May, the estate's formal gardens stretching in geometrical precision toward distant woods, while peacocks wandered the manicured lawns, trailing their iridescent plumage behind them like living jewels scattered across emerald velvet. And despite the beauty of the setting, Isabella felt only the cold weight of dread, settling deeper into her chest with each rotation of the carriage wheels bringing her closer to whatever confrontation or catastrophe awaited her in this place. Other guests were arriving in a steady stream of elegant equipages, ladies in travelling costumes of fine wool and gentlemen on horseback forming a colourful procession toward the grand entrance, where Lord and Lady Westbrook stood ready to receive their visitors with the practiced warmth of experienced hosts. And Isabella performed her role with mechanical precision, greeting her hosts with appropriate gratitude for the invitation, while her mind catalogued exits and calculated risks with the instinctive caution that had kept her alive through 3 years of dangerous work. She was shown to a modest but comfortable room on the 2nd floor, its windows overlooking the east gardens, and as soon as the maid departed, Isabella moved swiftly to examine the layout, noting that Lord Westbrook's study was located in the west wing on the ground floor, according to the intelligence Carstairs had provided, accessible through the main gallery if one could move unseen during the planned midnight supper when guests would be occupied with entertainment and most servants dismissed for the evening. A knock at her door announced the arrival of Charlotte Sinclair, her friend's familiar face providing the first moment of genuine ease Isabella had felt since departing London, and Charlotte embraced her with the fierce affection of someone who knew at least part of the truth about Isabella's complicated existence and loved her, despite, or perhaps because of her flaws and secrets. "You look exhausted," Charlotte observed with characteristic directness as she settled into the chair by the window, her blue eyes sharp with concern beneath fashionably arranged dark curls. "Tell me you are not involving yourself in something dangerous at this perfectly dull house party." Isabella managed a smile that felt brittle on her face and deflected with practiced ease, assuring Charlotte that she merely suffered from poor sleep and the general tedium of society obligations. But her friend was not easily fooled, and pressed until Isabella promised to confide more fully when circumstances allowed. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of new arrivals below, and Isabella moved to the window in time to see the Thornfield carriage pulling to a stop before the entrance, the ducal crest unmistakable even at a distance, and her heart performed an unwelcome acceleration as Alexander Pembroke descended with athletic grace and stood surveying the estate with that quality of focused attention she had come to recognize, his dark coat fitting his broad shoulders with the perfection that only the finest London tailors could achieve, his bearing projecting the confidence of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. Charlotte followed her gaze and made a soft sound of interest that immediately put Isabella on alert. "The Duke of Thornfield? How intriguing. I had not realized he would be attending. He rarely accepts invitations to these sorts of gatherings. You must tell me, Isabella, if the rumors circulating through London drawing rooms have any foundation in truth." Before Isabella could formulate a response that was neither confirmation nor outright lie, another voice cut through the air from the doorway where Lady Beatrice Langley stood with the expression of a cat who had discovered a particularly interesting mouse, her silver hair arranged in elaborate coils and her sharp features set in lines of barely concealed malice. "Mrs. Ashworth, how delightful to find you here, and with Miss Sinclair no less. I was just telling Lady Westbrook that it seems our charming widow appears wherever the most influential gentlemen gather, quite the remarkable coincidence, though I suppose some women possess particular talents for attracting powerful attention." The second day at Westbrook Manor dawned grey and cool, with morning mist still clinging to the gardens, when a footman delivered a note to Isabella's room, written in a strong, masculine hand that she recognized immediately as belonging to Alexander Pembroke. The message brief and direct, requesting her company for a walk through the estate grounds at 10 o'clock if the weather permitted, and though every instinct screamed caution, Isabella found herself penning an acceptance because refusing would create more suspicion than complying, and because some traitorous part of her heart wanted to see him again, despite the danger he represented to everything she had built. She dressed with particular care in a walking costume of deep blue wool that Charlotte had once said brought out the color of her eyes, telling herself the choice was strategic rather than personal, and descended to the entrance hall precisely at the appointed hour to find Alexander waiting with that quality of contained power she had noticed from their first meeting, his tall frame clad in riding, clothes that suggested he had already been out exploring the estate in the dawn hours while more leisurely guests still slept. They exchanged formal pleasantries under the watchful eyes of other guests lingering over late breakfast in the nearby morning room. But once they stepped outside into the cool air, fragrant with wet grass and early roses, Alexander steered them away from the manicured gardens toward a path that led into the wooded park where ancient oaks provided shelter from observation, and the only witnesses were songbirds calling territory in the branches above. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs as they walked in silence for several minutes, the crunch of gravel beneath their feet marking time, while she tried to prepare for whatever revelation or confrontation was coming. But when Alexander finally spoke, his voice was quiet and utterly without the anger or accusation she had braced herself to hear. "I think we have danced around truth long enough, Isabella, and I would prefer to speak plainly if you will permit me the courtesy of honesty between us." She felt her breath catch in her throat, but managed to nod, not trusting her voice, and Alexander continued with devastating directness. "I know you are gathering intelligence. I have traced your activities for the past 6 months. Your meetings with Lord Hartley and Sir James, and half a dozen other men who all possess information valuable to someone asking the right questions. And I know you are here at Westbrook Manor with purpose beyond social pleasure." The world seemed to tilt beneath Isabella's feet, and her first instinct was to deny, to deploy the practiced lies and manufactured confusion that had protected her through dozens of dangerous moments. But something in Alexander's steady gaze stopped the deception in her throat, and instead she heard herself asking in a voice that sounded distant to her own ears, "Are you here to arrest me?" Alexander's expression softened almost imperceptibly, and he shook his head slowly. "I am here to understand who you work for and whether you serve England or her enemies, because despite the evidence of your activities, I have also observed your character in our conversations, and I do not believe you are what you appear to be." Isabella felt tears prick behind her eyes at the unexpected mercy in his words, the suggestion that he might see something beyond the calculating seductress she had trained herself to become. And before she could stop herself, she whispered, "If you know so much, then you must know about Lord Carstairs." Alexander's jaw tightened with what looked like controlled anger, though she sensed it was not directed at her. "I know about Carstairs and his network of informants operating under the fiction of Crown service, and I know he is not the patriot he pretends to be, which is why I am not your enemy, Isabella. But I need you to trust me enough to tell me the truth about what you are doing here, and what Carstairs has sent you to steal from Westbrook's study tomorrow night." Isabella stared at Alexander as his words hung in the cool morning air between them, the revelation that he knew about Carstairs sending a fresh wave of fear and confusion through her chest, because if he understood the true nature of her handler, then everything she had believed about her work for the past 3 years might be built on foundations of sand rather than patriotic duty. And her voice emerged barely above a whisper when she finally asked what he meant about Carstairs not being the servant of England he claimed to be. Alexander's expression remained steady, but she could see anger tightening the corners of his mouth as he began to explain what his investigation had uncovered over months of careful observation and documentation, how Carstairs operated a network of informants under the fiction of Crown service, but used the intelligence gathered for personal profit as much as national security, selling information to the highest bidder, regardless of whether that bidder served British interests or merely paid well, and how the documents Isabella had been sent to steal from Westbrook's study contained not military intelligence about French operations, but rather financial information about certain lords that Carstairs intended to use for blackmail to extract money and favors from men whose only crime was trusting the wrong business partner. Isabella felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as Alexander continued speaking in that calm, measured voice that somehow made the devastating revelations more rather than less impactful, and she found herself sinking onto a fallen log beside the path because her legs would no longer reliably support her weight under the crushing realization that she had compromised herself, had done things that filled her with shame, had believed she was serving her country, when in truth she had been nothing more than a tool for a mercenary dressed in patriotic rhetoric. Alexander moved closer and crouched before her, so their eyes were level, his gaze intent but not unkind, as he said. He understood this was difficult to hear, but she needed to know the truth before she proceeded with the mission Carstairs had assigned, and then he offered her something she had never expected in this moment of exposure and vulnerability. A choice rather than a demand or threat. "I have been building a case against Carstairs for 6 months," Alexander said quietly. "But I need someone inside his operation who can provide testimony and help secure evidence that will convince the authorities to act. Someone who knows his methods and his network. And I believe you could be that person if you are willing to take the risk of working with me instead of for him, helping to expose his corruption while protecting the legitimate intelligence operations that actually serve England rather than one man's greed." Isabella looked into Alexander's face, searching for any sign of deception or manipulation. The habits of 3 years, making her skeptical of anyone offering salvation from her circumstances, but what she saw in his steady grey eyes was something she had almost forgotten existed in her world of shadows and lies. Genuine concern mixed with respect for her capacity to make her own choice rather than coercion disguised as care. "But why would you trust me?" she asked with raw honesty, "when everything you know about me suggests I am skilled at deception and motivated by self-preservation. How can you be certain I will not simply report this conversation to Carstairs and continue serving whoever pays me or protects me?" Alexander was quiet for a moment, as if weighing how much to reveal before he answered with unexpected vulnerability. "Because I have watched you for months, Isabella, and I have seen not just what you do, but how you do it. The subtle signs that you take no pleasure in your manipulations, the way your eyes go distant and sad when you think no one is observing, the careful line you walk to extract information without causing genuine harm. And because when we have spoken together, I have glimpsed the woman beneath the performance, someone who is tired of lying and hungry for something real, even if she no longer believes she deserves it." Isabella's hands trembled as she absorbed Alexander's words. The revelation that he saw beneath her masks, shaking something loose inside her chest that she had kept locked away for 3 years. But even as hope flickered dangerously to life, she could not silence the voice of survival that demanded proof before trust, and so she lifted her chin and met his gaze directly as she said with more steadiness than she felt that if he truly possessed evidence of Carstairs' corruption, then she needed to see it with her own eyes, because everything she had done since her husband's death had been built on the belief that she served England, even if the methods shamed her. And if that foundation was a lie, then she deserved to know the full truth before committing herself to another path that might prove equally false. Alexander nodded as if he had expected this response and respected her for demanding evidence rather than accepting his word on faith alone. And he said quietly that he would bring her documents that evening after supper when the other guests were occupied with cards and music, meeting her in the library where they could speak privately without arousing the kind of speculation that Lady Beatrice Langley was already too eager to spread through the drawing rooms. True to his word, Alexander appeared at the library door that night at 9:30, carrying a leather document case that he placed on the reading table before Isabella with the gravity of a man presenting evidence in a court of law. And as she opened it with fingers that wanted to shake and forced herself to read the correspondence inside, she felt her entire world shifting on its axis, letters in Carstairs' distinctive hand offering to sell intelligence about troop movements, to a Portuguese merchant who was known to have French connections, receipts for payments that far exceeded what any patriotic informant would require, and most damning a list of operatives including her own name with notes about which of them could be pressured or disposed of if they became inconvenient to his enterprise. Isabella read each document twice, while Alexander stood silent beside the table, giving her time to absorb the magnitude of the betrayal. And when she finally looked up at him, she found her eyes blurred with tears that came from rage as much as grief, because she had believed Carstairs when he told her she was serving something larger than herself, had justified every compromise and every moment of self-loathing by clinging to the idea that her sacrifices mattered for England's safety. And now she understood she had been nothing more than a tool for a man who wrapped his greed in patriotic language and used desperate people like herself to build his personal fortune and power. Alexander moved closer, and his voice was gentle when he said he knew this was difficult, that having one's purpose revealed as hollow was perhaps the cruelest wound. But he needed her to understand that what she had done under Carstairs' manipulation did not define her true nature any more than a sword defined the hand forced to wield it. And then he asked the question that would determine everything that followed. Would she help him bring Carstairs to justice? And in doing so, perhaps find a different kind of purpose beyond the shadows she had been living in? Isabella looked at this man who somehow saw past her performances to something she had stopped believing existed, and though fear still coiled in her stomach alongside the anger, she found herself speaking with an honesty that felt both terrifying and liberating, telling him, yes, she would help, but first he needed to understand who she truly was beneath the widow's weeds and calculated charm. And so there in the quiet library, while the sounds of distant laughter drifted from the music room, she began to speak of things she had told no one. Her husband Thomas, who had been charming and reckless and utterly incapable of resisting a gambling table, the debts that mounted until their home was forfeit, his death in a duel over a card game, leaving her with nothing but bills and the cold judgment of a society that blamed wives for their husbands' failures, and Carstairs appearing like salvation, offering her a way to survive and even to serve England if she would only use the assets she possessed, her appearance and her wit and society's willingness to underestimate women. And she had been so desperate and so angry at a world that gave her no honorable options that she had agreed. Isabella woke the next morning with a clarity of purpose that felt both liberating and terrifying, because she had made her choice in the quiet library to trust Alexander and help him expose Carstairs. But the practicalities of that decision became immediately complicated when Charlotte appeared at her door before breakfast with urgent news that she had overheard Lord Westbrook's valet mentioning another guest had been seen near the study late the previous night, someone who had no legitimate reason to be in that wing of the house at such an hour. Isabella's mind raced through the possibilities as she dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, because if someone else was also targeting the documents in Westbrook's study, then either Carstairs had sent another operative without telling her, which suggested he already suspected her loyalty, or more dangerous still, there was a French agent among the house party guests, which would mean the intelligence Carstairs sought was valuable enough to attract enemy attention. And the mission had just become infinitely more complex and perilous. She found Alexander in the breakfast room reading a newspaper with the studied casualness of a man who wished to appear unoccupied, and when their eyes met across the sideboard, she saw that he had already heard the same rumor and understood its implications, his slight nod directing her to the conservatory, where they could speak with less risk of being overheard by the other guests who were beginning to drift down from their chambers. In the humid warmth of the glass-walled room surrounded by exotic plants that Lord Westbrook collected with the passion of a man who needed hobbies to fill his purposeless days, Alexander spoke in a low voice about what he had learned from his own sources, that a French operative known only as Corbin had been tracked to the county 3 days earlier and had likely gained entry to the house party through forged credentials or by compromising a legitimate guest. Isabella felt the old instincts of survival sharpening her senses as she calculated the angles of this new threat, because if she failed to secure the documents, Carstairs would assume she had betrayed him. But if the French agent succeeded, Then information damaging to English interests would reach enemy hands regardless of Carstairs' corruption, and the only solution was to complete her mission while simultaneously preventing Corbin from achieving his, which meant she and Alexander would need to work together with a level of coordination and trust that went against every self-protective habit she had developed over 3 years of operating alone in shadows. Alexander seemed to read her thoughts in the tense set of her shoulders because he reached out and touched her hand briefly, a gesture of reassurance that sent unexpected warmth through her despite the danger they faced. And he outlined a plan with the calm precision of a military strategist, suggesting they move tonight during the midnight supper when the household would be distracted by entertainment, with Isabella entering the study as originally planned, while Alexander monitored the corridors for Corbin and created diversions if necessary to keep the French agent away from his target. The intimacy of conspiracy bound them together in a way that transcended the careful distance Isabella usually maintained with everyone in her life, and as they finalized the details of timing and signals, she realized with something approaching wonder that she was genuinely working with someone rather than merely using them or being used, that Alexander saw her as a partner with valuable skills rather than a tool to be deployed, and the experience of being trusted and valued for her true capabilities rather than her ability to deceive created a fragile hope in her chest that perhaps there could be a life beyond the shadows if they survived this night. The carriage wheels rattled over London cobblestones as Isabella returned from Westbrook Manor 4 days after the midnight operation that had secured the documents and led to the quiet arrest of the French agent Corbin. And though the mission had succeeded in every tactical sense, Isabella felt a profound exhaustion that went deeper than her body into some essential part of herself that had been performing for too long without rest. But there could be no rest yet, because Carstairs expected her report, and any deviation from her established patterns would raise the very suspicions she and Alexander were working to avoid until enough evidence accumulated to bring formal charges against her handler. She met Carstairs that evening at the coaching inn near Cheapside, where they typically conducted their exchanges, and she delivered a carefully edited account of events that portrayed her as having successfully obtained Lord Westbrook's documents, which she presented to him in a sealed envelope, minor intelligence about troop supply routes that was genuine enough to satisfy scrutiny, but outdated enough to pose no real security risk, while omitting entirely the presence of the French operative and Alexander's involvement in the operation. Carstairs examined the documents with his usual cold assessment and praised her efficiency before tasking her with attending a reception at the Austrian embassy the following week, where a particular attaché was suspected of having information about continental alliances, and Isabella agreed with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to hide every flicker of rebellion behind a mask of compliance, even as she felt the weight of living this double deception pressing against her chest like a physical burden. The next 3 weeks fell into a pattern that drained Isabella in ways her previous life as Carstairs' operative never had, because at least then she had believed in a purpose, even if the methods shamed her. But now she moved through society, gathering minor intelligence to maintain her cover, while meeting secretly with Alexander to coordinate the investigation that was slowly, methodically building an unassailable case against Carstairs through financial records and testimony from other operatives he had used and discarded. Their meetings began as strategy sessions held in carefully chosen locations where they would not be observed, but gradually the conversations deepened beyond tactics into territory that felt dangerously intimate. And one evening, in the private dining room of a discreet hotel, Alexander spoke with unexpected vulnerability about the isolation of his position, how his title created a barrier that most people never looked beyond to see the man himself, how he had spent years surrounded by those who wanted his favor, or his wealth, or his influence, but rarely saw him as simply human with doubts and desires and a longing for genuine connection in a world where nearly every interaction was performance. Isabella listened with her heart beating too fast, because she understood that loneliness in her bones had lived for 3 years as a constructed fiction that people responded to while her true self remained invisible and starving for recognition. And when she met Alexander's eyes across the table, she realized with a clarity that was both wonderful and terrifying that she was falling in love with the one man in all of England who truly saw her beneath her masks and did not turn away. The whispers began at Lady Pemberton's soirée on a humid evening in late June, when Isabella arrived to find the usual polite greetings replaced by sidelong glances and conversations that stopped abruptly when she approached. And though she had learned to navigate society's judgments with the same skill she applied to extracting secrets, she felt the particular quality of this scrutiny like ice against her spine, because it was not the usual assessment of her gowns or her jewels, but something more predatory and personal. Lady Beatrice Langley held court near the refreshment table, surrounded by other matrons whose heads bent together like crows over carrion, and when Isabella passed within earshot, she caught fragments of their conversation that made her blood run cold. Phrases like unsuitable attachment and woman of questionable background, and the Duke's inexplicable fascination with someone so clearly beneath his station. Isabella maintained her composure through years of practice, but her hands trembled slightly as she accepted a glass of champagne from a passing footman, and she became acutely aware that Alexander had not yet arrived, which left her exposed to society's dissection without the shield of his presence, though she hated herself for needing that protection, and for the way her heart lifted with relief when he finally entered the room 20 minutes later and immediately sought her out with his eyes. He crossed directly to her side with a deliberate quality that drew every gaze in the room, and he greeted her with a warmth that defied the cooling atmosphere surrounding them, asking if she would take a turn with him in the garden, as though her answer was the only thing of consequence in the entire gathering. As they walked among the rose bushes heavy with blooms that perfumed the evening air, Alexander spoke quietly about the rumors that had begun circulating, not with concern for himself, but with anger at the cruelty directed toward her, and Isabella realized with dawning horror that their investigation of Carstairs had required enough public interaction that society had noticed the Duke's attention to a woman they considered unworthy of such regard. She tried to laugh it off as the tone's endless hunger for scandal, but Alexander stopped walking and turned to face her with an intensity that stole her breath, telling her plainly that he cared nothing for their gossip and everything for her comfort, asking if the scrutiny had become unbearable, and whether she wished him to withdraw his public acknowledgement of their friendship. Isabella wanted to say yes, wanted to protect him from the damage she was causing to his reputation, but the words stuck in her throat because the thought of losing even the small legitimacy his regard provided felt like drowning, and before she could formulate any response, Charlotte appeared on the garden path with urgency in her expression and pulled Isabella aside to deliver a warning that Lady Beatrice was actively campaigning to have Isabella excluded from future invitations, spreading insinuations about her character that stopped just short of actionable slander, but were damaging enough to destroy what little social standing Isabella possessed. Alexander overheard enough to understand the threat, and his jaw tightened with barely contained fury. But Isabella touched his arm gently and asked him to let it pass, because any defense he mounted would only fuel more speculation, and she could not bear being the cause of scandal touching his name. He looked at her with such profound disagreement that she could see the argument forming behind his eyes. But what he said was simply that her reputation mattered because she mattered, not because of society's arbitrary standards, but because she deserved to move through the world without cruelty, and the fierce protectiveness in his voice made Isabella's carefully constructed defenses crack just slightly as she realized that Alexander was willing to risk his standing for her and that his willingness only deepened her guilt alongside her helpless growing love. Isabella woke the morning after Lady Pemberton's soirée with a resolution hardened by sleepless hours of wrestling with her conscience, and she knew with painful clarity that she must create distance between herself and Alexander before her presence destroyed everything he had built through years of principled service and unimpeachable reputation, because though her heart ached at the thought of withdrawing from the only genuine connection she had known in 3 years of living as a constructed fiction, she could not bear being the instrument of his social ruin. She sent him a brief note that afternoon, requesting they limit their meetings to only those absolutely necessary for coordinating intelligence matters regarding Carstairs, phrasing it in cool professional language that cost her something vital to write. And when Alexander appeared at her townhouse 2 hours later with her note crumpled in his hand and storm clouds in his grey eyes, she knew he would not accept her withdrawal without challenge. He did not wait for invitation, but walked past her into the small sitting room and turned to face her with barely contained frustration, asking what game she thought she was playing and whether she truly believed he was so fragile that a few malicious tongues could shake his regard for her. Isabella kept her voice steady through sheer force of will as she explained that this was not about his strength, but about basic mathematics, that his continued public attention to a woman of questionable background would inevitably damage his standing with the very people whose cooperation he needed for his work, advising the crown, and that she refused to be the weakness his enemies used against him. Alexander listened with his jaw tight, and when she finished, he crossed the space between them in 3 strides, and told her with devastating directness that she was not a weakness but the first genuine thing in his life in longer than he could remember, that he had spent years surrounded by performance and calculation, and people who wanted his title rather than seeing him, and that her assumption that she was somehow less worthy of regard than the hypocrites of the ton who whispered about her revealed nothing about her value, and everything about how deeply she had internalized their cruelty. His words struck something fragile inside Isabella's chest, and she felt the careful control she had maintained for so long beginning to crack as she tried to explain that he did not understand what she was, what she had done, the men she had manipulated and the lies she had told, and the fundamental corruption of a woman who had sold pieces of herself for survival. Alexander moved closer still, and his voice dropped to something almost tender as he challenged her litany of self-condemnation, asking whether she thought he was blind to the courage it took to survive impossible circumstances, whether she believed the intelligence and resourcefulness she had developed made her less rather than more remarkable, whether she truly could not see that the shame she carried was not hers to bear, but belonged to those who had left her no better choices. Isabella felt her throat tighten and tears begin to blur her vision as she whispered that she was not good enough for him, that everything about her was false and damaged and wrong. And when the first sob broke through her carefully maintained composure, Alexander closed the final distance between them and pulled her against his chest with arms that felt like sanctuary, holding her while 3 years of accumulated grief and shame and exhaustion poured out in wrenching waves that left her gasping and clinging to his coat as though he were the only solid thing in an dissolving world. The message arrived at Isabella's townhouse on a grey morning, 3 days after Alexander had held her while she wept, delivered by a street urchin who vanished before her housekeeper could offer a coin, and when Isabella unfolded the cheap paper, her blood turned cold at the terse instruction written in Carstairs' familiar angular hand, directing her to meet him at the warehouse near Limehouse Docks within 2 hours, the location itself a warning, because he only used that particular site when matters had turned dangerous or urgent. She dressed with hands that trembled despite her attempts at steadiness, choosing a simple day dress and pelisse that would not attract attention in the rougher neighborhoods near the river, and she left a note for Charlotte with her housekeeper in case she did not return, a precaution she had not needed to take in months, but which now felt grimly necessary given the crawling unease in her spine. The warehouse was exactly as she remembered from previous meetings, cavernous and dim with light filtering through gaps in the roof boards and the smell of hemp rope and river water thick in the stale air. And Carstairs stood near a stack of crates with his back to the far wall, positioned so he could see both entrances, his posture rigid with tension that immediately confirmed Isabella's worst fears. He did not waste time on pleasantries, but began speaking the moment she came within earshot, his voice clipped and cold, as he informed her that he had noticed discrepancies in recent intelligence, patterns that suggested someone in his network was feeding information selectively, withholding key details or providing material that later proved less valuable than initially assessed. Isabella felt ice spread through her chest, but she kept her expression mildly curious and faintly concerned, deploying every skill she had learned in 3 years of deception as she asked what he suspected and whether she could assist in identifying the leak, playing the loyal operative even as her mind raced through every interaction she and Alexander had carefully orchestrated over the past weeks. Carstairs watched her with eyes gone flat and calculating as he listed meetings she had reported, intelligence she had gathered, comparing them against information he had received from other sources, and Isabella realized with mounting horror that his web was larger than she had known, that he had other operatives whose work intersected with hers in ways that could reveal inconsistencies if examined closely enough. He circled closer as he spoke, invading her space in a deliberate intimidation tactic, and when he asked directly about her connection to the Duke of Thornfield, his tone carried an edge sharp enough to draw blood, demanding to know the nature of their relationship and whether she had been fully forthcoming about her interactions with a man known to advise the Crown on security matters. Isabella met his gaze without flinching and lied with a conviction born of desperation, explaining that the Duke had shown interest in her as men often did, and that she had been cultivating the connection slowly because his position made him too valuable a target to rush, that she had not mentioned it earlier because she had nothing concrete to report until she was certain of success. Carstairs studied her face for a long moment that stretched like wire pulled taut, and Isabella did not allow herself to look away or show any hint of the terror screaming through her veins. And finally, he smiled with no warmth whatsoever and told her that her explanation was convenient but required verification, that he needed proof of her loyalty and her usefulness, and he gave her a task that made her stomach drop like stone into dark water, demanding that she seduce specific intelligence from Alexander himself, details about Crown security protocols and the identities of agents working against French interests, information that would prove her access and her allegiance beyond any doubt, and he gave her 1 week to deliver results or face consequences he did not need to specify, because they both understood that betrayal of his network meant death. Isabella agreed with outward calm that cost her everything to maintain. And as she left the warehouse and emerged into the pale sunlight of a London afternoon, she felt the trap closing around her with inexorable force, knowing that she had just been handed an impossible task that would either expose her true allegiance or require her to betray the man she loved, and she had 7 days to find a way through a situation that seemed to offer no path but destruction. Isabella went directly to Alexander's residence the moment she left the warehouse, abandoning all pretense of caution because the urgency of her situation left no room for careful protocol, and when his butler showed her into the private study where Alexander stood reviewing correspondence near the windows overlooking his garden, she saw concern flash across his face the instant he registered her expression. She told him everything in a rush of words that tumbled over each other, Carstairs' suspicions and accusations, and the impossible task he had set her, the 7-day deadline, and the implicit threat behind his demand for proof of her loyalty. And as she spoke, She watched Alexander's expression shift from concern to calculation as his mind began working through possibilities and angles with the same methodical intelligence she had come to rely upon like a foundation beneath crumbling ground. Alexander asked precise questions about the specific intelligence Carstairs had demanded, what security protocols and agent identities he wanted revealed, and Isabella saw him mentally cataloguing each item against some internal framework of what could and could not be risked. What information, if exposed, would endanger lives versus what might be sacrificed in service of the larger objective of bringing Carstairs down before he sold. More secrets to enemies of the crown. They sat together at his desk as afternoon light slanted through the windows and began constructing an elaborate deception, creating false but convincing documents that would appear to contain sensitive information while actually revealing nothing that could compromise genuine operations, letters that referenced non-existent agents and outdated protocols mixed with just enough verifiable detail to pass Carstairs' scrutiny if he checked them against his existing knowledge. The work required hours of careful effort, matching handwriting styles and official seals, aging paper with tea stains, and careful folding to suggest documents handled and stored over time. And as they worked side by side, Isabella felt the terrible irony of the situation pressing against her chest like a weight, that she and Alexander must stage a convincing seduction and betrayal, must perform for Carstairs the very manipulation she had spent 3 years executing in truth, while now the stakes involved not stolen secrets, but the real and fragile thing growing between them. Alexander seemed to sense her distress because he paused in his work and reached across the desk to cover her hand with his own, telling her quietly that they would navigate this together, that the performance they would stage for Carstairs was necessary theatre, but it changed nothing real between them, that he trusted her completely even as they prepared documents designed to make him appear a fool, seduced and deceived by a woman he should have guarded against. Isabella looked at their joined hands and felt something break and reform in her chest as she understood that Alexander was offering her not just tactical partnership, but emotional sanctuary, that he recognized how much it would cost her to play this role again after finally allowing herself to be genuine with another person. And she turned her hand beneath his to lace their fingers together, and told him with a voice gone rough that she loved him, the words emerging without calculation or strategy, just raw truth she could no longer contain. And when Alexander drew her to her feet and into his arms, she felt the fear recede enough to believe they might survive what was coming. Alexander arranged a private dinner at his residence 2 evenings later, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to appear as though Isabella had engineered the intimacy, while in truth every detail had been planned between them with the precision of military strategy. And when she arrived at the appointed hour wearing a gown of deep emerald silk that caught the candlelight like water reflecting stars, she felt the familiar armor of her performance settling over her shoulders, even as her heart beat with an entirely different rhythm beneath the disguise. The staff had been dismissed early on Alexander's orders, leaving only cold meats and wine laid out in his private dining room so that they would be alone and unobserved, which served both the practical purpose of preventing witnesses to their supposed indiscretion and the deeper purpose of creating space where truth might exist alongside deception. And Isabella moved through the evening's choreography with practiced ease, laughing at Alexander's conversation with precisely calculated warmth, allowing her hand to linger on his arm a moment too long, pouring wine with the kind of attention that suggested she hoped to cloud his judgment and lower his defenses. Alexander played his assigned role with equal skill, feigning the gradual relaxation of a man succumbing to attraction and wine, his responses becoming less guarded and his gaze lingering on her face with apparent fascination, and anyone observing them would have seen exactly what Carstairs needed to see: a duke being expertly manipulated by a woman who had made seduction her weapon and her trade. After the meal, Isabella rose with graceful purpose and suggested she would admire his library, a transparent pretext they had agreed upon, and Alexander rose as well with slightly unsteady movements that suggested more intoxication than he truly felt. And when they entered his study, where the fabricated documents waited in a drawer, made to appear carelessly secured, Isabella felt the weight of performance press against her chest like a stone, because this room held no observers, and yet she must continue the charade, as though Carstairs himself might materialize from shadows to witness her betrayal. She moved to the desk with practiced casualness, trailing her fingers along its polished surface, while engaging Alexander in conversation designed to distract. And when she maneuvered herself close enough to access the drawer, she felt Alexander step behind her, his presence solid and warm at her back. And for a moment, the performance wavered as she became acutely aware of him not as a partner in strategy, but as a man she loved, standing close enough that she could feel his breath stirring her hair. The documents were exactly where they had placed them, and Isabella retrieved them with hands steadier than her heartbeat, tucking them into the concealed pocket she had sewn into her gown. And when she turned, she found Alexander watching her with eyes that held no pretense of intoxication, but instead burned with an intensity that made her forget momentarily that they were performing a fiction for an absent audience. He reached for her then, not with the clumsy eagerness of a seduced fool, but with deliberate intention, his hand cradling her face with a gentleness that shattered what remained of her performance. And when he kissed her, there was nothing false in the contact, nothing calculated or strategic, only the raw, honest truth of desire and affection that had grown between them through weeks of shared danger and deeper understanding. Isabella responded without thought or plan, her arms rising to circle his neck as she kissed him back with all the longing she had been carefully suppressing beneath. Layers of necessary deception, and in that moment the elaborate charade they had constructed fell away entirely, leaving only two people who had found each other against all probability in a world built on lies, and now claimed this one genuine thing amidst the surrounding performance. Isabella waited until the following afternoon to arrange her meeting with Carstairs, choosing the same discreet coffee-house near Cheapside, where they had conducted exchanges a dozen times before, the kind of establishment where merchants and clerks conducted business over stained tables, and nobody paid particular attention to a well-dressed widow meeting quietly with a gentleman who might be her man of business or a distant relation. She arrived with the fabricated documents concealed in the false bottom of her reticule, her heart beating steady and controlled, despite the weight of what she carried and what she must now perform, because this meeting required perhaps her most flawless deception yet, convincing Carstairs that she had successfully seduced and betrayed the man she actually loved, while hiding the fact that every document she delivered was a carefully constructed lie, designed to expose Carstairs himself as the true traitor to crown and country. Carstairs was already seated in the corner booth when she entered, his angular face showing the carefully neutral expression he always wore in public. And when Isabella slid into the seat across from him, she allowed herself a small smile of triumph, the kind of self-satisfied expression a woman might wear after successfully completing a difficult and dangerous task that proved her worth and secured her position. She passed the documents across the scarred wooden table with casual confidence, keeping her voice low and steady as she told him about the private dinner at Alexander's residence, the wine and conversation that had lowered his defenses, the moment she had searched his study while he was distracted by her company and his own foolish attraction to a woman who had made manipulation her trade. Carstairs took the documents and examined them with methodical attention, his eyes scanning each page with the kind of focus that made Isabella's pulse quicken despite her outward calm. because she and Alexander had spent hours crafting these forgeries, but there remained always the possibility that some detail might betray their work, some inconsistency in handwriting or protocol that would alert Carstairs that he was being played in return. But after several long minutes of examination, Carstairs looked up with an expression of satisfaction that sent cold relief through Isabella's chest, and he told her quietly that she had done excellent work, that these documents contained exactly the intelligence he needed for his purposes, and Isabella felt the bitter irony of hearing praise for a betrayal she had not actually committed, while the real betrayal she was perpetrating went undetected beneath his calculating gaze. Then Carstairs revealed his intention for the stolen intelligence, and Isabella felt her carefully maintained composure waver as she understood the full scope of his treachery, because he explained with casual confidence that he would use the information about Crown security protocols to blackmail Lord Ashford, a cabinet minister with influence over military appointments and access to funds that could be redirected through careful manipulation. And Isabella realized that Carstairs had never been serving England's interests, but only his own ambition and greed, using patriotic agents like herself as tools to gather leverage he could convert into power and wealth. She maintained her expression of interested attention while her mind raced with the implications, understanding that Alexander's suspicions had been entirely correct and that the evidence his investigators were gathering would be more than sufficient to see Carstairs arrested and tried for treason. But she also understood that she must continue her performance for a few more dangerous days until the trap could be sprung. And when Carstairs dismissed her with instructions to maintain her connection to Alexander and await further assignments, Isabella left the coffee house with the knowledge that the endgame had finally begun, and soon she would be free of the man who had controlled her life for 3 long years. Isabella received the summons 2 days later when she returned to her townhouse after a morning call with Charlotte, finding a sealed note waiting on the hall table with no identifying marks, but written in the angular script she had come to know and dread over 3 years of covert service. And when she broke the wax and read Carstairs' terse instruction to meet him immediately at a location she had never used before, an abandoned warehouse near the docks rather than their usual discreet coffeehouse, her stomach twisted with the cold certainty that something had gone terribly wrong with their carefully constructed plan. She went without delay because hesitation would only confirm suspicion, arriving at the specified address as afternoon light slanted through broken windows to illuminate dust motes dancing in the stale air, and Carstairs stood in the center of the cavernous space with his back to a stack of rotting crates, his face set in an expression of such controlled fury that Isabella felt ice crystallize in her veins, even as she maintained an outward appearance of calm inquiry. He wasted no time on pleasantries, but instead told her with quiet venom that he knew she had betrayed him, that he had suspected her duplicity from the moment she delivered documents that were too conveniently detailed, and had tested her by revealing the blackmail scheme specifically to see whether she would warn the Duke or attempt to interfere. And when Alexander's investigators had begun making inquiries among Carstairs' contacts 2 days ago, it confirmed what he had already deduced about her treachery. Isabella's mind raced through possible defenses and denials, but Carstairs cut off her forming words by producing a leather folder from inside his coat, opening it to reveal what he claimed was documented evidence of every intelligence operation she had conducted over the past 3 years, each seduction and theft and betrayal carefully recorded with dates and names and details that would see her hanged as a spy and traitor if brought before the authorities, who did not know that she had been working under Crown sanction, however unofficial that sanction might have been. He told her with terrible clarity that he had always kept insurance against his operatives, documentation that could be used to ensure their silence or cooperation, and now he would use hers to guarantee his own escape and revenge, because he offered her a choice that was no choice at all: either kill the Duke within the next 24 hours and destroy the evidence Alexander had gathered against him, or Carstairs would deliver his documentation to the Crown prosecutors and watch her hang for treason while he disappeared with resources he had already secured in preparation for this contingency. Isabella stood frozen in the dusty warehouse light, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might shatter her ribs. And when Carstairs dismissed her with instructions to decide quickly whether she valued her own life more than her lover's, she left without speaking because words had abandoned her entirely. And within the hour, she was at Alexander's residence, demanding entry with such desperate urgency that the butler abandoned protocol and brought her directly to the study where Alexander was working. She told him everything in a rush of words that tumbled over each other, about the warehouse meeting and Carstairs' threats and the supposed evidence that would condemn her, watching Alexander's face shift from alarm to focused concentration as he listened. And when she finished, he took her hands in his and told her with absolute certainty that Carstairs was bluffing because any real documentation of her activities would equally implicate Carstairs himself, and no spy master kept records that could expose his own operations. But even as relief began to seep through her panic, Alexander's expression remained grave because he acknowledged that while Carstairs might lack real evidence, he remained dangerous and unpredictable, a cornered man with nothing left to lose and every reason to lash out at those who had trapped him. Alexander moved with decisive speed once Isabella's panic had subsided into trembling resolve, sending urgent messages to Sir James Worthing at the Home Office and 2 trusted agents who had been tracking Carstairs' activities for weeks. And within 3 hours, a plan had been formulated to confront Carstairs at his Mayfair residence before dawn the next morning, when he would be unprepared for coordinated action, and before he could disappear into the network of safe houses and false identities that any competent spy master would have prepared for emergencies. Isabella insisted on accompanying them despite Alexander's initial resistance, arguing with cold logic that her presence might prevent Carstairs from destroying evidence or taking his own life because he would still harbor some hope of manipulating her or using her as leverage, and Alexander finally agreed because he understood that she needed to face the man who had controlled and used her for 3 years, needed to stand witness to his downfall as part of reclaiming her own agency and future. They arrived at Carstairs' elegant townhouse just as grey light began seeping across London's rooftops. Sir James and 4 armed agents positioned at front and rear entrances, while Alexander and Isabella approached the main door with the authority of the Duke's position and a warrant signed by the Home Secretary himself. And when Carstairs' startled butler opened to their insistent knocking, he had no choice but to admit them into the marble-floored entrance hall where morning shadows still pooled in corners, and the house held the particular silence of a place whose inhabitants had not yet stirred. Carstairs appeared at the top of the stairs within minutes, dressed in shirt-sleeves and waistcoat as though he had been awake and working through the night. And when he saw Isabella standing beside Alexander with Sir James and the agents behind them, his face went through a rapid progression of expressions from surprise to calculation to a kind of cold fury that made his angular features look sharp enough to cut. He descended the stairs with deliberate calm and invited them into his study with the courtesy of a gentleman receiving expected guests. But Isabella could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes tracked every position and exit, the predatory awareness of a trapped animal seeking any possible escape. And when they assembled in the book-lined room where she had received so many assignments over the past 3 years, she felt the bitter irony of returning here for the final confrontation. Sir James presented the evidence with bureaucratic efficiency, laying out documented proof of Carstairs selling Crown intelligence to foreign buyers, of manipulating agents for personal profit, of the blackmail scheme involving Lord Ashford, and a dozen other instances of treason that carried a mandatory death sentence, and Carstairs listened with an expression of mild interest as though they were discussing someone else's crimes rather than his own carefully constructed empire of manipulation and betrayal. Then Carstairs began to negotiate, his voice smooth and reasonable as he suggested that his arrest would expose dozens of ongoing operations and active agents across Europe, that his knowledge was valuable enough to trade for clemency or transportation rather than execution. And he looked directly at Isabella as he mentioned how many operatives would face exposure and death if he were forced to use the insurance documentation he had prepared, playing his final card with the calculated desperation of a man who understood he had already lost but might still inflict maximum damage in defeat. Alexander stepped forward then and presented additional evidence that Carstairs had not anticipated. Testimony from 3 of his former agents who had already agreed to testify against him in exchange for protection, financial records seized from his banker that morning showing payments from French and Austrian sources, and most damning of all, the revelation that his supposed documentation of Isabella and other operatives had been located and secured 2 days ago when Alexander's agents had searched a warehouse Carstairs owned under a false name, eliminating his leverage entirely. Carstairs' composure finally cracked, and he lunged not toward the door, but toward his desk, where Isabella suddenly understood he kept a pistol in the top drawer, and she moved without conscious thought, her body responding with the trained reflexes he himself had taught her, intercepting him before he reached the weapon and using momentum and surprise to throw him off balance while Alexander and the agents closed in from behind. They struggled briefly, Carstairs fighting with vicious intensity born of absolute desperation, while Isabella defended herself with skills learned through 3 years of covert work that had required her to be more than just a charming seductress. And when the agents finally pulled Carstairs away and restrained him with iron manacles, Isabella stood breathing hard with her hair disheveled and a scratch bleeding on her cheek, feeling simultaneously exhausted and strangely liberated because she had physically participated in ending the chapter of her life that he represented. Sir James formally arrested Carstairs for high treason and espionage, and as the agents led him toward the door, Carstairs looked back at Isabella with an expression of pure hatred and told her that she was a fool to think the Duke would actually marry her, that men like Alexander used women like her and discarded them once their usefulness ended. One final attempt to plant doubt and pain even in defeat. But Isabella met his gaze with steady calm and told him that he understood nothing about love or loyalty because he had spent his life manipulating both, and she watched without regret as they took him away into the grey London morning, where a closed carriage waited to transport him to a secure cell where he would await trial and the gallows that surely followed. The arrest of Lord Carstairs sent shockwaves through London society within 48 hours, despite the Crown's attempts at discretion, because gossip moved through drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs with the speed and inevitability of wildfire, and Isabella found herself at the centre of a scandal that made her previous notoriety as a charming widow seem innocent by comparison, when whispers began circulating that she had been involved with a traitor arrested for espionage and treason. Lady Beatrice Langley led the assault with gleeful viciousness, spreading carefully edited versions of the truth that painted Isabella as either Carstairs' accomplice or his dupe, neither interpretation leaving room for respectability. And within a week, Isabella received the cut direct from 3 society matrons at a musicale, and found invitations that had been extended now quietly withdrawn, as hostesses protected their reputations by banishing anyone tainted with association to such spectacular criminality. Charlotte came to Isabella's townhouse on the 5th day after Carstairs' arrest, finding her friend pale and silent amid half-packed trunks, and urged her with gentle insistence to leave London immediately before the scandal grew worse, to retreat to some quiet corner of the countryside, where she might live in obscurity until society's notoriously short memory moved on to fresh sensations. Isabella agreed with numb resignation, because she could see no alternative future, no path forward in a world that had already judged and condemned her, and she began making arrangements to let her townhouse and remove herself to a cottage in Derbyshire that Charlotte's family maintained but rarely used, an exile that felt both necessary and utterly final. Alexander remained conspicuously absent during these days of social dissolution, occupied, as Sir James had explained, with extensive depositions and meetings as the Crown untangled the full scope of Carstairs' network and tried to salvage legitimate intelligence operations from the wreckage of his treachery. And Isabella told herself firmly that his absence was entirely appropriate because their partnership had been strategic and temporary, born of necessity rather than genuine personal connection, despite the kiss they had shared, and the intimacy she had foolishly allowed herself to believe meant something more than expedient cooperation. She drafted a brief note to Alexander on the 7th day, thanking him formally for his assistance and protection and informing him of her departure, a message so carefully impersonal that Charlotte read it and immediately tore it up, insisting that Isabella at least deserved a proper farewell conversation. But Isabella refused because she believed with desolate certainty that Alexander would feel relieved by her disappearance, that his duty was complete, and she had been only an assignment, however kindly he had treated her during its execution. On the morning of the 9th day after Carstairs' arrest, Isabella stood in her stripped townhouse, among corded trunks and covered furniture, wearing a travelling dress of sombre grey and watching dawn light creep across bare floors. And she felt hollowed out and ancient, despite being only 28 years old, as though the past weeks had burned through whatever remained of hope or possibility and left only ash and the mechanical necessity of continued existence in whatever diminished form that existence would take. Isabella was fastening the last clasp on her travelling trunk when she heard the sharp knock at the front door, the sound echoing through the nearly empty townhouse with a hollowness that matched the desolation in her chest, and she assumed it was the carter come early to collect her belongings for transport to Derbyshire until she heard Alexander's voice in the entrance hall speaking to her housekeeper with the quiet authority that characterized everything he did, and her heart lurched with a confusion of hope and dread because she had convinced herself that she would never see him again, that their connection had been merely circumstantial and would dissolve naturally once the crisis that created it had passed. She descended the stairs slowly, acutely conscious of her plain travelling dress and the disorder of her hair, the visible evidence of her diminished circumstances and imminent exile, and when she entered the parlour, she found Alexander standing by the window in the morning light, looking tired and rather drawn, but also somehow more vital and present than any other person she had ever known, and the sight of him made her realize with devastating clarity that she loved him in a way that transcended strategic partnership or grateful affection, loved him with the kind of totality that made her own planned disappearance feel like a kind of death. He turned when she entered, and his expression shifted through relief and something that looked remarkably like pain before settling into determined resolution, and before she could offer any polite greeting or explanation for her departure. He crossed the room and took both her hands in his and told her with stunning directness that he loved her, that he had loved her probably since that first conversation at the Westbrook house party, when she had argued philosophy with genuine passion instead of calculated charm, and that he wanted to marry her if she would have him. Isabella felt the words land like physical blows, each one striking against the armor of resignation she had constructed over the past 9 days, and she immediately began to protest, pulling her hands from his and stepping back as she listed all the reasons why marriage was impossible, how society would never accept her as his duchess, how the scandal of her association with Carstairs would taint his reputation and position, how she would become a burden and an embarrassment to him when he deserved someone whose past was not shadowed by espionage and deception, and the kind of compromise that respectable women never faced. Alexander listened to her litany of objections with patient attention, letting her exhaust herself with arguments that sounded increasingly hollow even to her own ears. And then he systematically dismantled every barrier she had erected, speaking with the same logical precision he had used when presenting evidence against Carstairs, but now applied to the case for their future together. He told her that society's acceptance mattered far less than his own certainty, that his position was secure enough to weather scandal, and that he had already secured quiet support from powerful allies who knew the truth of her service and sacrifice. But more importantly, he spoke of seeing her courage in facing Carstairs, her intelligence in navigating impossible situations, her fundamental capacity for love and loyalty despite 3 years of being forced to perform false intimacy. And he insisted that these qualities constituted her true worth rather than the judgments of people like Lady Beatrice Langley, who understood nothing of real difficulty or real bravery. Isabella felt something cracking open inside her chest, some frozen place where she had locked away hope and possibility, and she realized that Alexander was offering her not just marriage, but genuine recognition, the chance to be fully known and still completely accepted, and the magnitude of that gift made her feel simultaneously unworthy and desperately hungry for the life he was describing. Alexander reached into his waistcoat pocket with deliberate slowness, withdrawing a small velvet box that looked worn with age and handling, and when he opened it, Isabella saw a ring of elegant simplicity, a sapphire the color of deep twilight surrounded by small diamonds that caught the morning light streaming through the parlor windows, and he told her quietly that it had belonged to his mother, who had worn it for 30 years of marriage to his father, and had made him promise on her deathbed to give it only to a woman he loved with absolute certainty, not for political advantage or social expectation, but for the truest reasons of compatibility and mutual recognition. Isabella stared at the ring with blurred vision, because the significance of the gesture overwhelmed her defenses more effectively than any argument could have done, this offering of something precious and irreplaceable that represented his family's history and his personal commitment, and she understood that he was not proposing a marriage of convenience or rescue, but something far more substantial and demanding, a genuine partnership built on complete knowledge of who she truly was beneath every performance and disguise. She tried one final time to articulate her unworthiness, speaking of the things she had done under Carstairs' direction, the men she had manipulated, and the lies she had told, and the fundamental compromise of living 3 years as someone she was not. But Alexander stopped her words by taking her hand and sliding the ring onto her finger where it fit as though made for her, and he told her with fierce conviction that her past did not define her except in demonstrating her strength and resilience, that the woman who had survived impossible circumstances and still retained the capacity for genuine feeling was precisely the woman he wanted beside him for whatever years they were granted. Isabella looked down at the ring on her hand and felt something shifting inside her like ice breaking up after a long winter, the rigid belief in her own unworthiness beginning to crack under the steady warmth of his regard, and his refusal to accept her self-condemnation. And she realized that accepting his proposal meant accepting a fundamentally different story about herself, one in which her experiences had shaped but not destroyed her, one in which she deserved happiness despite having made choices that still caused her shame and regret. She met his eyes finally, and saw in them such patience and certainty that she felt her resistance crumbling entirely, and she spoke the word yes in a voice barely above a whisper, agreeing not just to marriage, but to the revolutionary possibility that she might be worthy of love and respect, despite everything she had been forced to become. Alexander pulled her into his arms with undisguised relief and joy, holding her tightly enough that she could feel his heart beating against her own. And he spoke against her hair about the future they would build together, a wedding that would happen within 6 weeks before society could mount organized opposition, a life at Thornfield and in London, where she would take her place as his duchess, and use that position however she chose, and most importantly, a marriage based on absolute honesty and mutual knowledge, where neither of them would have to perform or pretend or maintain careful distance from their truest selves. The wedding took place on a brilliant morning in early June, when the gardens at Thornfield were in full bloom, and the air carried the scent of roses and honeysuckle. And though Lady Beatrice Langley had attempted to organize a systematic boycott of the ceremony, Alexander's quiet conversations with several influential peers had resulted in a respectable attendance that included Charlotte Sinclair weeping openly in the front pew, and even a few members of the cabinet who understood the true nature of Isabella's service and sacrifice. Isabella walked down the aisle of the private chapel in a gown of ivory silk that Alexander had insisted on commissioning from London's finest modiste, and as she moved toward where he stood, waiting with an expression of such undisguised joy and certainty, she felt the final remnants of her shame and self-condemnation falling away like a chrysalis she no longer needed, replaced by the revolutionary understanding that she was worthy of this moment and this man and this new life they would build together. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of sensation and emotion, the weight of Alexander's hand as he slipped the sapphire ring onto her finger, now joined by a gold band, the sound of his voice speaking vows of faithfulness and partnership, the moment when he kissed her as his wife with a tenderness that acknowledged everything they had survived to reach this point, and when they emerged from the chapel into the June sunshine, as the Duke and Duchess of Thornfield, Isabella felt reborn into a story she had never imagined possible for someone with her history. The months that followed brought challenges as society slowly adjusted to her new position, and she learned to navigate the complex responsibilities of being a duchess. But Alexander remained her constant anchor and champion, and together they discovered the profound joy of a marriage built on complete honesty, where neither had to perform or pretend or maintain careful distance from their truest selves. 18 months after their wedding, Isabella stood in the drawing room at Thornfield, looking out over the estate grounds, where a group of young women were arriving for the program she had established to provide education and employment opportunities for those facing desperate circumstances similar to what she had once endured. And she felt Alexander's arms come around her from behind as he rested his chin on her shoulder and told her quietly how proud he was of the work she was doing and the woman she had always been beneath every necessary disguise. Perhaps you have faced moments when your past felt like an insurmountable barrier to the future you desired, when shame or regret or the judgments of others convinced you that transformation was impossible and happiness was reserved for those whose stories were simpler and cleaner than your own. But Isabella's journey reminds us that it is never too late for new beginnings, that love which sees us truly and completely can heal wounds we thought permanent, and that our struggles and compromises and survival can become sources of strength and compassion rather than merely scars to hide. The possibility exists for each of us to be fully known and fully loved, to find someone who looks past our performances to our essential worth, and to build lives of purpose and connection regardless of where we have been or what we have done to survive. So may you have courage to believe in second chances and the revolutionary power of genuine recognition and acceptance.